So what do you think of the idea of sort of delegating power back down to the states instead of centralizing back up into a central government that does have the capacity to be used by both sides for corrupt purposes, for example?
It depends. I mean, I think that, it's funny because I've always been super focused on national politics, but over the last several years, I've been a lot more honestly fascinated with what's happening in California. I think for obvious reasons, local politics is fascinating to me. And in terms of what impacts my day-to-day life, I've realized that these local decisions have more of an impact than what's happening on a federal level. There's a lot of gridlock and a lot of nonsense happening on a federal level. So I think that's part of the reason why it's not coming down to impact our lives on a daily basis. I think the federal government should be tasked with important regulations to protect the consumer because greed is a thing, okay? The fiduciary responsibility to shareholders is real. And so how do you balance that with the need to protect workers and consumers? I think you need a federal government and a regulatory body to focus on that. When it comes to civil rights, you need that protection on a federal level. You can't just leave it to the states. You don't want one state to say, nah, we're not into interracial marriage. We're going to ban that. Or we don't want to, have equal rights based on, or equal rights for everyone. Some races we like more than others. You need a federal government to protect civil rights. But I do agree with you that Americans have not been paying enough attention to what's happening on a local level. There are certain things that can be dealt on a local level that doesn't need to be the responsibility of the federal government. And to be quite honest with you, with all the dysfunction and gridlock with the federal government, I think more and more people are relying on a local level to get policy passed that they desperately need.
So in a second, I want to talk to you about local politics versus national, because I think that the national politics does lead to extraordinary polarization, whereas, as we'll talk about in a moment, when it comes to local politics, everyone gets a lot more moderate when they're talking about their own particular
That's very
community.
True.
First, the debt ceiling is now above $31.4 trillion. Inflation is still well above 7%. People are getting fired at major companies all across America. Well, let's say you wanted to hedge your bets against the future of our economy. The best thing to do would probably be to diversify at least a little bit into precious metals. For over 5,000 years, gold has withstood inflation, geopolitical turmoil, and stock market crashes. Owning gold in a tax-sheltered retirement account would be a smart thing to do. Converting your IRA or 401k into an IRA in precious metals, you can do that with my friends over at Birch Gold. They have a 5-star rating with the Better Business Bureau. I've invested part of my money in precious metals because, again, I like to diversify. This is what all smart investors do. They take some of their money, they put it in a different place to make sure that they are not overloaded in one place. As the stock market goes through a rough period, it might be kind of smart to have some money in gold. Text BEN to 989898. Claim your free info kit on gold today. Then talk to one of the precious metal specialists over at Birch Gold. That's Ben. Text it to 989898 today. My friends over at Birch Gold will get you started. Okay, so let's talk about the local level. So, we're talking about the sort of conflict at the federal level, and federal politics tends to bring out I think, the worst in people, mainly because it feels like, okay, for me, I'm a Floridian now, which I'm very happy about. People from New York keep trying to tell me what to do. Why can't they leave me alone, leave my children alone, leave my life alone, leave me alone? If you leave me alone in my community with people who I have chosen to live with, which means that we are going to have much more commonality of interest, we're going to come to a policy that works much better for me and my family than people who live 1,000 miles away and who don't know me, don't know my family, don't care about me. And I think that, that return to localism may be the only way forward for the country. I want to talk to you about what's happening in LA. So obviously, I grew up in LA. I spent my entire life in LA until 2 years ago when I picked up my entire family and moved over here. Now my parents live here. My in-laws live here. 2 of my sisters live here. There's been a mad rush to Florida, particularly by people who are sort of the red state mentality. But I don't think it's purely about, I needed to be in a conservative area. Again, I'd lived my entire life only in blue areas, whether it was Los Angeles or Cambridge, Massachusetts, when I was in law school. And so the thing that drove me out of California is, I think, one of the things that you've been picking up on and getting a lot of flack from your own side for picking up on, and that is that LA has just become a trash heap. I mean, it's been governed awfully. Forget about who's governing it.
Right.
The policies that have been used to govern it are just terrible. You have an increase in crime. Homelessness has taken over the streets. And when I was living there, I've pretty famously talked about this. And it was the kind of place where I had a very nice house in a pretty decent neighborhood, and we had a gate in the front. And we would open the gate, and there would be a homeless person face down in the gutter, Edgar Allan Poe style, or there would be a guy outside the house shooting heroin into his foot. And I've got a 5-year-old. And this sort of stuff has become incredibly common in LA. You noticed it, and you've been getting all sorts of flack for it.
Right, because when there are problems in society, we need solutions. And you can't find solutions unless you acknowledge what the problem is and then properly diagnose it. So My biggest issue right now, at least with the way the left has handled the discussion on homelessness in places like Los Angeles, is there's this housing first mentality where, oh, everything would be fine as long as we put everyone in housing. And by the way, let me just note, housing is an important component to this. There is a housing crisis. There's a lack of inventory. I think we all know that. We do need to build more housing. But at the same time, treating the homeless population as if it's a monolith has been a complete failure. There is a huge mental health crisis happening in this country. So people with severe mental health issues are just left to die on the streets. And in some cases, because they are experiencing an episode, they could carry out some sort of act of violence and assault someone. And it's a dangerous situation for everyone, okay? The people who are just trying to go about their day and the person who is left on the streets battling with this untreated mental health issue. There are people who are obviously struggling with drug addiction, and you look at the number of overdose deaths, and it has skyrocketed. The approach that we have implemented is clearly not working. More people are dying. And I get so much flack for saying this. I want an actual solution. It is insanely cruel to watch people die on our streets and then give yourself a pat on the back because you think you did something compassionate. That is not compassionate. There's this insanity right now where, let's say we're talking about the same person struggling with a severe mental health issue. They're living on the streets, asking them if they are willing to take the housing that's offered to them. But someone who has a severe mental health issue, I know the left would argue if they engaged in some sort of sexual act with someone, the person who engaged in that act with that person with the mental health issue took advantage because that person with a severe mental health issue does not have the ability to consent. But somehow we're just going to take their word at face value when it comes to housing. No, we need to get that person help. They need help. And I don't care how vicious people think I am for saying that. It's just common sense. It really is. And denying that the problem exists is the other part of this, right? Denying that there was definitely an increase in crime in big cities drives me crazy. I was assaulted in my own neighborhood. I shared the story. I was shocked at the kind of reaction I got from people who I typically agree with politically. Took my dog out for a walk. Two guys who were clearly on something. They appeared to be homeless. Were walking by me or behind me as I was bending over to pick up my dog's mess. One of the guys grabbed me by the hips and started thrusting at me with an erection. And I know that I wasn't raped. I get it. But at the same time,
that's not the standard.
Something like that for a woman who does not have the ability to defend herself in that moment. I had no weapon, no nothing. I have to think about that at least twice a day when I take my dog out for a walk. It is traumatizing. Yes, I've gone to therapy about it. I'm working through it.
That's not your personal problem. But that's because you were assaulted. Yes.
What's making it worse, though, is that I'm the bad guy for sharing this story and saying, hey, we can't just let this kind of stuff happen. We need to find real solutions for it.
It's utter insanity to me that has become a matter of public controversy. And this is why I say that when people in their communities see the problem, there should be broad-scale agreement, but you do have a cadre of people who live in a lot of these cities, and I will say in blue cities particularly with crime, who are not affected by crime because they're not living where you live.
Yep.
Which you live in a fine, where you live, I know that area well. It's where I lived most of my life. It's a fine area, but it's not up in the hills, right? It's not up in Malibu. And it's not at Barbara Streisand's estate where she's got armed guards outside. And so those people who are really spending a lot of money and making policy and deciding on no cash bail and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And we can't, it's an aspect of freedom. We have to have the ACLU suit to make sure that the police are not allowed to remove people's stuff from the street because it's an aspect of freedom to be sleeping on the street. And the fact that those people are so disconnected from the concerns of everyday life that it becomes a sin for you to mention the consequences of their policy is so dangerous because how else are you going to adjudicate whether the policy is good or bad if you can't talk about the consequences of the policy?